Today, I want to offer 7 observations drawn from the Louisiana opinion. First, the Louisiana court found, based on overwhelming evidence, that federal officials are the cause of the censorship of the viewpoints they disfavor. The government likes to claim that social media platforms acting on their own would apply their policies and censor all this content anyway. This is demonstrably incorrect. Again and again, the Louisiana court found that the platforms would not have suppressed this speech, but for the fact that the federal officials were pushing for it. The deplatforming of Alex Berenson, the throttling of Tucker Carlson's content, the silencing of the so-called disinformation dozen, which includes Mr. Kennedy, the suppression of much of the so-called borderline, which is, quote, often true content on Facebook's platforms, the censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story, and much more. All these were suppressed because of the efforts of federal officials.
Man, it is insane, but it is clown world. And the fact we're even having to have this discussion is a disgrace to everything our founding fathers stood for. Tell me one time in history when the guys silencing their enemies were ever the good guys. It's okay. I'll wait, we got time. The state's violation of the First Amendment rights were on full display in the government weaponization and attack of free speech hearing featuring RFK Jr., and there were fireworks. Now, this is a fundamental debate that is critical to a free future, and while the state seeks to silence you, there is an awakening, and you can't find it to be fully a coincidence that the biggest freedom of speech proponent on the presidential ballot in 2024 is also arguably the biggest Bitcoin proponent as well. I'm here to remind you that the fight for free speech is the fight for Bitcoin, and we got a lot to cover. Let's get it.
A government that can censor its critics has license for every atrocity. It is the beginning of totalitarianism. There's never been a time in history when we look back and the guys who were censoring people were the good guys. All of us grew up reading Arthur Koestler, Robert Heinlein, Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, and they were all saying the same thing. Once you start censoring, you're on your way to dystopia and totalitarianism.
That's right, baby. Let's make Orwell fiction again. And man, there were fireworks. Let's get started with RFK's opening statement. Now we're going to let it run and then react and try to get in as much as we can. This was like a 3-hour hearing. We're going to try to crunch as much signal in here as we can, but let's get it started with RFK's opening statement.
And that is why the First Amendment's important. Debate, congenial, respectful debate is the fertilizer, it's the water, it's the sunlight for our democracy. We need to be talking to each other. Now, this is a letter that many of you signed, many of my fellow Democrats. I've spent my life in this party. I've devoted my life to the values of this party. There's 102 people signed this. This itself is evidence of the problem that this hearing was convened to address. This is an attempt to censor a censorship hearing. The charges in this, and by the way, censorship is antithetical to our party. It was appalling to my father, to my uncle, to FDR, Harry Truman, to Thomas Jefferson, as the chairman referred to. It is the basis for democracy. It sets us apart from all of the previous forms of government. We need to be able to talk, and the First Amendment was not written for easy speech. It was written for the speech that nobody likes you for. And I was censored not just by the Democratic administration, I was censored by the Trump administration. I was the first person censored by as the chairman pointed out, by the Biden administration 2 days after it came into office. It ordered a truthful, and by the way, they had to invent a new word called malinformation to censor people like me. There was no misinformation on my Instagram account. Everything I put on that account was cited and sourced to peer-reviewed publications or government databases. Nobody has ever pointed to a single piece of misinformation that I publish. I was removed for something they called malinformation. Malinformation is information that is true, but is inconvenient to the government, that they don't want people to hear. And that's antithetical to the values of our country. After I announced my presidency, it became more difficult for people to censor me outright. So now I'm subject to this new form of censorship, which is called targeted propaganda, where people apply pejoratives like anti-vax. I've never been anti-vaccine, but everybody in this room probably believes that I have been, because that's the prevailing narrative. Anti-Semitism, racism, these are the most appalling, disgusting pejoratives, and they're applied to me to silence me, because people don't want me to have that conversation about the war, about groceries, about inflation, about the war on the middle class in this country that we need to be having. But I am being censored here through this target, through smears, through misinterpretations of what I've said, through lies, through association, which is a tactic that we all thought we had been discredited and dispensed with after the Army McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. But those same weapons are now being deployed against me to silence me. Now, I want to say something I think that's more important, and it goes directly to what you talked about, ranking member, which is the need, this toxic polarization that is destroying our country today. And how do we deal with that? This kind of division is more dangerous for our country than any time since the American Civil War. And how do we deal with that? How are we every Democrat on this committee believes that we need to end that polarization. Do you think you can do that by censoring people? I'm telling you, you cannot.
You can't silence opposition. You can't silence free speech. You can't stop people from assembling. You can't thwart all your detractors and still claim to be a proponent of freedom, democracy, anything of the like. And what I love about RFK is actually what followed this statement, and kind of the ethos in Bitcoin is the fact that it isn't right or left or Republican or Democrat. If you're kind of falling in that loop, you're kind of already been co-opted by the duopoly psyop, because both parties, I mean, they just recently redeclared the NDAA, so they both agree on fighting against American civil liberties. But let's talk about the fact that freedom brings people together, and that's what Kennedy is hitting on here.
That only aggravates and amplifies the problem. We need to start being kind to each other. We need to start being respectful to each other. We need to start restoring the comedy to this chamber and to the rest of America, but it has to start here. My uncle, Edward Kennedy, has more legislation with his name on it than any senator in United States history. Why is that? Because he was able to reach across the aisle, because he didn't deal in insults, because he didn't try to censor people. He brought home people who were antithetical to what he believed in. He came home almost every weekend with people like Orrin Hatch to our house at the compound in Hyannisport. At that time, Orrin Hatch to me was like Darth Vader, because I was an environmentalist. And I was saying, why is Teddy bringing this guy home? But he knew that he was effective because he understood that comedy and respect and kindness and compassion and empathy for other people is the way that the only way to restore the function in this chamber. And I want to point out also that the chairman pointed to Dennis Kucinich, who's fighting behind me. There is no two people in the country who feel more differently about American politics than these two people, and yet they were friends. Dennis attended his children's basketball games, attended his daughter's wedding. This is what we need, how we need to start treating each other in this country. We have to stop trying to destroy each other, to marginalize, to vilify, to gaslight each other. We have to find that place inside of ourselves of light, of empathy, of compassion, and above all, we need to elevate the Constitution of the United States, which was written for hard times, and that has to be the premier compass for all of our activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to raise a point of order.
Oh, and of course, the great irony. None other than Debbie Wasserman Schultz. As soon as RFK finished this and there was a round of applause, she stepped in to put in an order to silence RFK and go into executive session. Now, it was voted down, but it clearly shows, and this is what Bitcoin does. It exposes people, their incentives. Are you pro-freedom or are you pro-control? And we are seeing exactly who is who.
Gentlelady can state a point of order.
Point of order pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, which Mr. Kennedy is violative of. I move that we remove into executive session because Mr. Kennedy has repeatedly made despicable anti-Semitic and anti-Asian comments as recently as last week. Rule 11, Clause 2 says, whenever it is asserted by a member of the committee that the evidence or testimony at a hearing may tend to defame, degrade, or incriminate any person, or it is asserted by a witness that the evidence or testimony that the witness would give at a hearing may tend to defame, degrade, or incriminate the witness, and it goes on. Mr. Kennedy, among many other things, has said, I know a lot now about bioweapons. We put out hundreds of millions of dollars into ethnically targeted microbes. The Chinese have done the same thing. In fact, COVID-19, there is an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. The races that are most immune to COVID-19 are...
Gentlelady making a motion or a speech?
I've made a motion to move into executive session because Mr. Kennedy's testimony...
Mr. Chairman, I
and
move
his
to table the
previous
motion.
statements-
It's just hilarious that on a hearing about government free speech, that members of the government are actively trying to censor the guy with the whole issue at hand. It's this, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, everything that's been going on over the past 2 to 3 years, it has finally become laughable at this point. Just look at the writer who first published the Hunter Biden story. You know, I just look at her give this statement and I'm like, wow, this lady is so based. She's right up there just laughing in front of their face. And that's part of this. Live fearless, rebel, speak your truth, and Bitcoin will help you find that truth. But let's get into this because it was awesome and hilarious.
On October 19th, 5 days after the Post began publishing, Politico ran a story headlined, Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo, dozens of former intel officials say. God, I can't even say that with a straight face, you know? Politico printed a letter completely uncritically from veteran members of the U.S. intelligence community, falsely claiming that the Post expose has, quote, all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. My God. Most notable among the signatories of that letter were Jim Clapper from former DNI, Michael Hayden, former CIA, John Brennan, former CIA, despite having such damaged credibility following their participation in the Russia collusion conspiracy theory.
Now let's get back to just how big of a deal this was. As we had in the opening, we kind of led you in with what was going on, the ramifications, but there were 7 points he was totally making, Sauer was making, and let's get to the rest of that because it is truly enlightening, and this is, the Supreme Court backed it up. So here we are, free speech continues to win, but we must stay vigilant.
Second, the scope and reach of federal censorship is staggering. As the Louisiana court repeatedly found, it affects, quotes, millions of social media posts and speakers all across America. It affects virtually every American who reads, listens, engages, or posts on social media about great disputed political and social questions that federal censors have stuck their fingers into. Third, federal censorship is ongoing and it shows no signs of relenting. Federal officials' censorship efforts are in full swing, and they're expanding to new frontiers. Left unchecked, federal censorship will reach virtually any disputed social and political question over which federal officials want to impose their power. Fourth, the Louisiana opinion shows that federal officials are most eager, most focused on silencing truthful speech and to muzzle the most influential critics of the administration and its policies. Tucker Carlson, Alex Berenson, and many others were targeted not because what they were saying was necessarily false, but because it was the most effective criticism of the narrative line that the administration was pushing at the time. Censorship is not about truth. It is about power, preserving and expanding the power of the censors and the political narratives they prefer. Fifth, federal officials are deeply intertwined with what other witnesses have called the censorship industrial complex. The Louisiana court made very detailed findings about the close connections between many federal officials and that mass surveillance and mass censorship enterprise that calls itself the Election Integrity Partnership and the Virality Project. Not just CISA officials, but White House, State Department, and Surgeon General officials have deep ties to that enterprise. As the Louisiana court found, CISA and the EIP were completely intertwined. Sixth, federal officials don't just dictate the outcomes of specific content moderation decisions. They also directly induce changes to the content moderation policies of major social media platforms to ban disfavored viewpoints in advance. And seventh, the federal censorship enterprise has succeeded in transforming online discourse by rendering entire viewpoints virtually unspeakable on social media, which is the modern public square. This ongoing distortion of the most fundamental American freedom, the right to free speech, is intolerable under the First Amendment. Thank you.
Now we're going to go here to kind of the face of the opposition in this hearing, Stacy Plasket, and we're going to let you talk about, she's going to do her virtue signaling and throw names around about racism, bigotry. We can't allow, you can speak, but you can't have a place to say anything or whatever. But we've got some good little nuggets on Stacy Plasket, but let's get what she had to say first.
Again, I go back to just the fact that we are creating a platform for this kind of discussion, not about the censorship, not about free speech, but the content of some of that speech that we are amplifying in this room. I'm appalled and just so troubled by colleagues that I have to work with, that these are individuals who would bring a witness who's promoted a video that compared the COVID vaccine to the Tuskegee trials.
Stacy might have a little conflict of interest, and we're going to go ahead and get into this clip, but apparently, the representative took money from none other than Jeffrey Epstein. Sounds like the kind of lizard people that would want to stifle free speech, huh?
I believe the ranking member said she was deeply concerned about the affiliation, and we seem to have a guilty by association theme going on here. And so I just have to state for the record that I myself am deeply concerned about the affiliation of the convicted sex trafficker, Jeffrey Epstein, of which the ranking member took campaign donation money from. So I think that's the beauty of the First Amendment, is that we have a right to say what we want to say, but we also have the right to be offended. So I just wanted to point that out.
Now we're going to get into our next clip, and this is Thomas Massie. He's kind of a more libertarian in Congress, but he just sheds light on the idiocy of the fact that they're trying to actively censor RFK in a hearing about government censorship. God, this is nuts. But this was an incredible exchange, and we keep seeing courageous individuals continue to speak their truth and call out the bullshit when they see it. So here we go. Thomas Massie, then RFK follows up, and RFK breaks down the difference between disinformation and malinformation, which is what he was being flagged for. Information that was true, but was just inconvenient to the people in power.
Wow. The irony and cognitive dissonance from the other side of the aisle. It's deafening. You could cut it with a knife. They are at the same time denying that censorship is occurring, but suggesting that there's more material that needs to be censored. This is a hearing on censorship that began with an effort, with a formal motion from the other side of the aisle to censor Mr. Kennedy. They do not want him to speak, yet that is the topic of this hearing. They have kept him from speaking. A collusion between the government and private organizations. Mr. Kennedy, in your opening statement, you introduced us to this word malinformation. Can you tell us more about this made-up word, what it means, and some of the things that you've said or tried to say that you've been censored for that's been characterized as malinformation?
Yes, Congressman Massie, and if by your leave, I'd like to just respond very briefly to some of the, what I would call defamations that have been just applied to me by the ranking member. I'm happy to talk to you about my opinions on these issues, what you have stated and tried to associate me with through guilt by association is simply inaccurate. Virtually everything, every statement that you just made about me is inaccurate. I have never advised Black Americans not to receive vaccines. At one point you say I'm anti-vax, and that's a bad thing. The other moment you point out that all my children are vax. I'm fully compliant with the vaccine schedule myself, except for COVID. I took flu vaccines for 20 years straight. I have never been anti-vax. I have never told the public avoid vaccination. The only thing I've asked for, and my views are constantly misrepresented, so that the truth of what I believe is not, we're not allowed to have a conversation about that with the American people, which I believe vaccines should be tested with the same rigor as other medicines and medications. You tried to associate me a moment ago with the replacement theory, which is racist.
No, I did not say you
Time
had the
belongs to the
replacement
gentleman
theory.
from-
I
I
said
did
my
not-
colleagues.
Time belongs to the gentleman from
I
Kentucky.
denounce that theory. It is racist, and I have never endorsed it or had any association with it. Our film on a medical, by the way,
Medical apartheid?
Bill Buxton, who is the Black CDC official who ultimately exposed the Tuskegee experiment, tried for years and years to appeal to CDC to stop it for 40 years. Finally, he got relief by walking into my uncle's office in the building next door. Teddy held hearings and ended the experiment. I remember that very well. And to say that I created a film that encourages blacks not to get adequate medical care is just completely abhorrent.
Don't misuse my words.
It's the witness's time. Do not censor the witness.
I'm
if
not
the-
censoring
if
the
the-
witness.
Yeah.
I'm not
If the-
censoring the witness. He's still talking.
It's
I don't
my
have the
time, and I've
ability to
given it to
censor.
the witness. Do not censor him.
I'm not
the-
censoring him.
If the views that you and others have applied to me, I've attributed to me, if they were actually true, I can see why I shouldn't be able to testify here today. Those are not true. These are defamations and malignancies that are used to censor me, to prevent people from listening to the actual things that I'm saying. And I think, Ranking Member, that we should have a real conversation rather than an exchange of ad hominem attacks. And answer very quickly to your question, the term malinformation was coined to describe information that Facebook and Twitter and the other social media sites understood was true, but that the White House and other federal agencies wanted censored anyway for political reasons because it challenged official orthodoxies. I'll give you one example. I was included in a group called the Disinformation Dozen. And Facebook and others were asked to censor us, which they did. And by the way, my Heck Aaron post, it was taken down. My whole Instagram account with 900,000 people was taken down because of that. Oh, they knew, Facebook knew that the Disinformation Dozen claim, and what they said was the Disinformation Dozen came from this very shady group called the Center for Preventing Digital Hate in England that's funded by dark money that should be looked into. They claim that 65% of the vaccine misinformation on the internet was generated by those 12 people. Facebook itself said that is impossible. That is false information. We know that not to be true. And yet, when the White House asked them to censor this Disinformation Dozen, including me, they did it anyway when they knew it to be untrue.
And going back to the clip earlier, what RFK said, if we're going to fix things, we've got to have a First Amendment. You cannot have a free market. You cannot even have a semblance of a claim of democracy, a republic, or anything other than a tyrannical oligarchy at best.
I'm frightened by where we go.
May I, Mr. Chairman?
You may not. You may not.
I just
Mr.
want to
Chair.
respond.
Mr. Chair,
I don't
the time
think-
is out. We're done.
I haven't adjourned the hearing, and I don't think you're the chairman.
wanna-
Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair,
Chairman's discretion.
I
We're gonna
know
let
it's
Mr.
your
Kennedy-
discretion,
We're going
but
to let Mr. Kennedy.
he has had so much additional time.
Well, I think everyone's had
Why?
additional time. and we're gonna
Why?
get-
Why are you doing that specifically for him?
Because
I
we
just
don't.
want
As
to
opposed to other
explain.
people.
I'm sure the
the
witness,
super
explain
PAC.
I'm sure the
on
Democratic
other
witness will be
places.
as short as he possibly can.
No. Are you going to allow our witness to just give another piece?
No,
of
let him
information?
address
I
the
wanna
defamatory
acknowledge-
comment that was made
Address-
about him that's untrue.
That was not defamatory. That is a legal definition that was not met.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Gentleman from Louisiana.
Is it the custom of this committee to censor viewpoints that we disagree with from
Mr.
witnesses?
Chairman, I have
That's
a
not a
motion-
point of
I have a
order.
motion.
Bitcoin will restore our First Amendment rights, and the fight for free speech is the fight for Bitcoin. They're inseparable. In a world where information is power, the ability to freely express our thoughts and ideas is fundamental to a flourishing society, yet our freedoms have been threatened by our institutions and centralized authorities. Censorship, the control over our digital lives, but thank God we have Bitcoin, the revolution that transcends borders, governments, and intermediaries. Bitcoin is not just a financial asset, it's a beacon of hope for those who cherish freedom. It embodies all those core principles, along with its qualities of decentralization, transparency, and immutability. All these qualities are critical to safeguarding our right to free speech. With Bitcoin, we possess the power to transact and communicate without fear of interference or suppression. Let's start to imagine a world where our financial transactions are private, shielding from prying eyes. And we're going to get into this more tomorrow on a technocrat dystopia. And these eyes seek to silence all dissenting voices. In the bright orange future, oppressive regimes will not be able to control your finances or limit your ability to support causes that you may believe in. Bitcoin paves the way for this reality. As we embrace Bitcoin, we fortify the foundation of our First Amendment, a cornerstone of a free republic or democracy that actually protects our freedom of expression, not just words on paper, and our religious rights, the freedom of the press, as we saw the government work so hard to silence because it exposes how inept and how evil these people really are. The fight for Bitcoin is the fight for a digital future where ideas can flow freely, where truth can triumph over censorship, and where innovation. Let's remember the pioneers who fought for freedom in all forms throughout history. They envisioned a world where information could not be controlled, where ideas could not be stifled, and where individual liberties were cherished above all else. Today, we're going to continue that legacy by championing Bitcoin as a tool of empowerment. As we move to the digital age, we must unite to preserve the principles that make our society just and fair. Embracing Bitcoin is more than a financial decision. It's an act of defiance against oppression and affirmation of our commitment to free speech. So, Bitcoiners, plebs, freedom lovers everywhere, let us stand together, passionate advocates of Bitcoin, defenders of free speech, and champions of liberty. Embrace the power of Bitcoin, and together we shall restore the First Amendment to its rightful place in the bright orange future. I'm your host, Rustin. We are Simply Bitcoin. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and spread the sound money gospel. And oh yeah, live fearless, rebel, refuse to be silenced.